Went into this film with like super low expectations and I still managed to come out disappointed, so I guess that was an achievement in a way. Aquaman follows the definitely compelling story of a guy split between two worlds. The surface world where he lives with his dad, who's a really good actor who's in this film for a reason I don't understand, and Atlantis through his mother, who is a very good actor who is in this film for some reason I don't understand. The plot follows Aquaman going on an epic quest searching for a secret artifact that will give him the right to the throne in order to overthrow his tyrannical relative and become leader of Atlantis, an amazing underwater kingdom. The plot then is basically trying to tell two stories. One of them is about Aquaman and Mera searching for this legendary trident in a sort of globe-trotting adventure that mostly takes place on dry land, which is much better because it means that they're kind of interacting with something that we're familiar with, and there's this kind of fish out of water type story that's being told. And that's like a derivative and boring film, but it's a reasonable approach. It's tried and tested, we've seen it before. The other plot concerns Orm, Aquaman's half-brother, as he tries to bring together the different armies and kingdoms of Atlantis in an assault on the surface world. And that's kind of a sizable chunk of the film's runtime. That story fails pretty much completely because there is way too much exposition. There's so many scenes that are people going, as you know, or in our long history, as I'm sure you're aware, to each other. It ends up feeling like a retread of the kind of Aragon plot of gathering the different armies from Lord of the Rings, but it also manages to be super forgettable, not least because the villain lead is fundamentally bland and not that interesting or exciting, and also because the setting itself is just incredibly dumb. I've always thought that Aquaman was kind of fundamentally, centrally a dumb concept, because after all, it's about a guy whose main gift is that he can talk to fish. But then again, my two favourite superheroes are a mentally ill orphan billionaire who uses his fists to fight poor people on the streets, and a guy who can spunk out of his wrists to swing around New York on little fake ropes. So maybe it's a your mileage may vary situation. So I knew the film had an incredibly goofy concept going in, and to their credit, they tried to lean into that, but it just doesn't work. I think part of the problem is that realising that underwater setting requires so much CGI that essentially for a vast amount of the film's runtime, it's like watching video game cutscenes. The CGI itself is actually well executed, but the problem is that it's just so visually busy that it's really hard to make sense of anything on screen.
It's so dense, every single image has so many things going on.
And I'm not talking about the battle scenes. I think this is pretty much a major criticism for all blockbusters now, that there's way too much CGI and that big battle scenes just get a bit confusing and full. No, what really made those scenes suck for me was the dialogue scenes, because the characters are just slowly bobbing up and down in the water, and their hair is waving around a little bit as they talk. And so they're just going like this, and their voices have been mixed in such a way that it sounds like they're kind of like slightly underwater, but not really. And maybe they're speaking with their minds, because I don't understand how people are supposed to be able to hear each other underwater. And if you're finding this, me bobbing up and down, slowly distracting now, then imagine what it's like watching it for 2.5 hours on screen, and you start to see a major problem with Aquaman and its underwater setting. I say the effects work was good, but that's actually just for the underwater stuff. I was actually shocked a little at how ropey some of the dry land sequences were in the film. In particular, there's a couple of bits of really bad looking green screen, which is just such like a fundamental concept to CGI that seeing it this badly executed in a major motion picture, and not, you know, when I'm watching it on Netflix or anything, but like on the big screen, it's just kind of mind-boggling that in a film of that size and budget, that effect shots like that would get past quality checks. And that's not even touching on the de-aging effects that the characters have undergone for some scenes in the film. Temeura, Morrison and Nicole Kidman look like Ken and Barbie basically in this, but the worst is surely Willem Dafoe. They've smoothed out his iconic face so much that he's barely recognisable, and in particular those really kind of gaunt cheekbones that he has aren't really that visible on screen. And that's especially weird because those scenes are set in like probably the early 90s, and I know what Willem Dafoe looked like then because I can go back and watch films like Mississippi Burning, and shock horror, he looks quite similar to how he looks now. He doesn't look like this de-aged android character. Just as an aside, I feel like that technology is there now and people therefore feel like they must use it, but I wish they would just use younger actors and kind of allow us to suspend our disbelief, because for me it's easier to do that than looking at these kind of like smoothed out fake characters on screen. And not only that, but it gives a kind of valuable stepping stone to younger actors as well for them to get more exposure and work. So it just feels like a lost opportunity in some ways. The film opens with this heartfelt sort of fantasy, princess comes out of the sea story, and then immediately segs into this big action sequence where Nicole Kidman's character is fighting off these Atlantean agents who have come to collect her. It's shot in a really distinctive way with these big wide lenses and the camera craning all over the place and zooming around and stuff. And it's a really strong aesthetic. So I was sitting there thinking, well, you know, I don't like James Wan's other movies, but maybe here he's decided to do something really strong and visual looking, and this will feel different to that quite identikit feeling about how people cover fights in blockbusters at the moment. So the next major action sequence is Aquaman raiding a submarine that's been taken over by submarine pirates. Yeah, I just feel like Aquaman is so dumb. Anyway, so this sequence is the same thing with those wide angles and the camera kind of flying around, but it starts to do this thing that just plagues this movie, where it is constantly doing speed ramping and kind of pushing into a character's face for one-liners that are underwritten by guitar sounds. And it just feels really cool, but in a very heavily focus grouped way. Like they got a team of 13 to 15-year-old boys and sat them down and said, what could make this sequence cooler? Should this be in slow motion? Should there be electric guitars here? Should we have a one-liner there? The whole effect of it really just reminds me of those toy adverts for action figures that you see on Saturday morning TV.
Dr. X turns up the heat, but Action Man Bowman has him in his sights. With working bow and arrows, he really fires to shaft X's plans. Action Man, the greatest hero of them all.
I think my major problem with that is that it speaks to a real insecurity on the part of the filmmakers, that they don't think people will find their characters cool or compelling unless they do really cool stuff. It's not enough for Aquaman to board a submarine, save a load of lives, and beat up a load of trained mercenary soldier people. He has to say one-liners while he's doing it over his shoulder. He can't just come down the hatch and attack these people. The camera has to push in on him, play electric guitars, and him say mind if I come aboard? And the whole thing feels really false, especially when that's come pretty much directly after this relatively heartfelt fairy tale narrative that's trying to happen there. And that's really the crux of the problem with this film, is that it never really feels like a cohesive whole. And it's not like it's the sum of its parts either, because each part of it is bad in its own way. It has its own issues in each different style or genre that it attempts to do. The film veers wildly from high fantasy to comedy to romance to action to adventure. The soundtrack's moving from these epic orchestral swells to electric guitars to remixed 80s pop songs like Toto is in there for some reason. And it's not like it's fun, because it doesn't have this warm approach to its silliness and its stylistic variety like Kong, Skull Island. It feels much more artificial than that. And it's not like it has this compelling story at the heart of its stupidity, like Pacific Rim. It's just a mishmash of poorly thought through commercial decisions, none of which really gel. I'll put it like this: I counted 4 times that someone's conversation in the film was interrupted by someone exploding through an object towards them to start a fight. And that's exactly what watching the film feels like. This isn't an abstract or a really highly aesthetic concern either. It actually ruins a lot of the character work that takes place in the film. Manta, who's pretty much the most compelling villain in the Aquaman canon, and I say that very lightly because I think a lot of it is really dumb, but I have seen a good version of Manta, like in previous stuff. For instance, Young Justice has a really good interpretation of that character. In one of his early scenes, they set up this really tragic backstory for him, and they're starting to make him a compelling character. And then he gets given some Atlantean technology to make his kind of iconic suits and weaponry. And it suddenly turns to this comedy montage that's set to heavy music and even has a comedy beat in it where his helmet malfunctions, that's basically ripped from the first Iron Man movie, which, came out a decade ago. Never thought I'd be sitting here seriously talking about the problems in an Aquaman film, but there you go. I've reviewed 2 Ant-Man films now, so anything can happen. Is there anything to like about the film? The cast is good, but very misused. Momoa tries his best at the leading man shtick, and it doesn't quite land. I feel like Hollywood is really looking for a leading man at the moment. That's why they keep pushing Chris Pratt so hard. But Momoa has kind of a similar problem to Chris Pratt. The problem with Pratt is that he can do the funny stuff and he can do the action stuff, but when he does the romance and the interpersonal interactions, he could come across as a bit callous and a little cruel. He hasn't made that warmth come through like someone like Harrison Ford managed to do. Momoa's issue is that he can't make the dramatic beats land. They just feel a little forced. Amber Heard is kind of neither here nor there. She literally didn't make enough of an impact on me in her performance throughout the entirety of this film for me to even really feel like I have anything to comment on in what she did. Patrick Wilson as the ostensible bad guy King Orm is aggressively bland. There's nothing really interesting about his character, and I don't know if that's his fault or the script. I'm inclined to say it's both. It doesn't help, of course, that almost all of his scenes take place underwater, so he's constantly doing this all the time, and his hair's bobbing around with CGI. God, this is infuriating to watch on screen. Yahya Abdul Matteen II is pretty good as Manta, who, like I said, is kind of an important character in that mythos. He's slightly scuppered by the script and also by the terrible costume that he has to wear as that character. I mean, that's literally the closest thing the film has to like a compelling narrative, is him hunting Aquaman in a kind of revenge for his father's death at Aquaman's hands, and yet they totally scupper it by having such a comic accurate costume that he just looks ridiculous as he walks around with this giant helmet on. But don't worry about them, they're kind of the forgettable ones, which obviously isn't something you want to say about the leading cast of your movie, but this film did it, so there you go. And then the people I'm really interested in are the supporting cast, who are either really well known in a kind of pop culture sense, like Dolph Lundgren, or really well considered, well respected actors in their own right, like basically everyone else. So many of them just look so lost in the film that they're in. What is Willem Dafoe doing here? What is Nicole Kidman doing here? What is Temeura Morrison doing here? Why is there a giant CGI tentacle creature whose voice actor is Julie Andrews? What was going on in James Wan's mind when he made the film? There's not a single decision in this movie where I sat back and thought, yeah, that seems like the reasonable way to approach that. That seems like it makes sense. I can understand your thinking here. I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's not very good. That's it from me, but as ever, I want to see what you thought about this terrible, terrible film. Please let me know in the comments down below, and I want to see those big, big arguments. I want to see 800 words minimum in every single comment, right? Side of A4, Harvard referencing style, turn it into me by the end of the week and I'll give you a mark before the new year. And don't forget to click like and subscribe because I just need the stats. That's it. I'm just going to be transparent about it. I need the stats. So, Merry Christmas and have a good one. Bye for now.